Hey, it's Mrs. Sobek. I'm here to review with you over Chapter 6, Sections 1, 2, and 3, so that you can get ready for your quiz. All right, let's go. So the first question, who won the French and Indian War? Well, you should remember that the French and Indian War was actually fought between the French and the British over the piece of land that we call the Ohio River Valley, and the winner of that war was the British. So the British actually gained the Ohio River Valley from this war. And because of that, colonists start to move out into that territory. The Native Americans that live out there were not happy about colonists being able to move out into land that should or originally was theirs. And so they start to attack colonists who are out on what we call the frontier. The British government sees this as a problem. They see that colonists are out there getting attacked by Native Americans and that there's no way that they can afford to put enough soldiers out into the frontier to protect all of those colonists. So they passed a new law called the Proclamation of 1763. Okay, and the Proclamation of 1763 is actually a line at the Appalachian Mountains, and that the colonists cannot cross. They're not allowed to move out beyond that boundary line because the British say that they can't provide them with any protection when they're out there. Okay, the colonists are mad about that. They want to be able to move out into this land. It was a really great land for farming. There was a potential for the fur trade out there. They want to be able to move. Okay. All right, the British government also starts to have a revenue problem. Okay, and the word revenue is really important to understand. Your revenue is your income. So revenue means the money that is coming into a country. Most of the time, if it's a government that's getting revenue, that revenue is coming in the form of taxes, that the people who are a part of that country are paying money to the government. Okay. The British, after the French and Indian War, have a really strong need for revenue. And the reason that they need that is because they have debt. They need to pay back their war debts, meaning they borrowed money in order to fight the war. Now they've won the war. Now they need to pay back that money that they borrowed, but they don't have it. And so they do what pretty much any government would do, and they raise taxes in order to pay back that debt. So one tax that they put onto the colonists is called the Sugar Act. And the Sugar Act is a tax on imports, especially sugar. That is not a direct tax. That tax is avoidable. If you don't want to pay a tax on sugar, you simply don't have to buy sugar. But a couple of years later, or maybe it's only 1 year later, the British government puts another tax on the colonists, and this one is a direct tax. This tax is called the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act is a tax on official documents like wills, contracts, newspapers. And those things are a lot harder to avoid ever needing. And so all colonists find themselves having to pay this tax at some time, especially lawyers and newspaper publishers. So the Stamp Act causes a lot of anger in the colonies. Okay, King George III is an important person whose name you need to know, and he is important because he is the King of Britain during the whole Revolution. Leading up to the Revolution and the Revolutionary War itself. So anytime in this period that we're talking about the King of Britain, we're talking about King George III. Okay. All right, number 7, another law that the British were passing against the colonists was called the Quartering Act. So the British had sent a whole bunch of soldiers, 10,000 soldiers, over to the colonies with the role of protecting the colonists. And those soldiers needed somewhere to live. Quarters is an old-fashioned way of saying house. And so the Quartering Act comes about out of finding a place for these soldiers to live. The problem is the British government still doesn't have any money. So this is a law that says that colonists have to provide, which means pay for, the housing and supplies that the British soldiers need. If the British government isn't going to provide that, it's going to be the colonists that are going to provide that. And if you're a colonist, you're really mad about that because many colonists didn't think that the British soldiers needed to be there in the first place. Okay. All right, one famous quote that the colonists start to use, this comes from a man named James Otis, is that taxation without representation is tyranny. Meaning that if the government isn't going to allow the people to have representatives or to have a voice in the government, then it is not fair for the government to also tax those people. And so since the colonists didn't have any kind of a say in Parliament, they made the argument that any taxes that were put on them were totally unfair. Okay. After the Stamp Act, we see a huge growth in protests. The people starts in Boston but quickly spreads, form a secret society called the Sons of Liberty. And the Sons of Liberty are really focused on protesting against the Stamp Act and trying to get it repealed. They do violent protests and they do peaceful protests. One peaceful protest that the Sons of Liberty organized was a boycott. Boycott means you refuse to buy. And so the colonists decided to, as a group, refuse to buy everything that the British are producing. And so in doing that, they cost the British a lot of money. So that takes us then to question number 11. Why does Parliament repeal the Stamp Act? Well, they're kind of forced to repeal it. The boycott had been too effective. The boycott had cost the British too much money. And they have to repeal then the Stamp Act in order to get the boycott to stop so that they can get their trading partner back. Okay. The next section on this review has a few important people that you have to know about. We've got Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry is a famous Virginian who was a leader in protesting the Stamp Act. So he does a lot of public speaking about why the Stamp Act is wrong and why the British government should take it away. Okay, John Adams is another name that you're going to have to know. John Adams is famous in this time period because he is the lawyer who actually defends the British soldiers in the Boston Massacre. And he's the reason why he gets them a not guilty verdict, meaning that the people of the trial find that those soldiers were actually not guilty of any crime because John Adams was their lawyer. But eventually he's going to become a revolutionary too. So don't think that John Adams is just always on the side of the British, because he's definitely not. Okay. Then we have another important Adams. It's John Adams' cousin, but that's not why he's important. Samuel Adams is important because he was the leader of the Boston Sons of Liberty. So at one time, he was one of the most, I can't spell liberty today. At one time, he was one of the most sought after criminals, according to the British government, because he was leading all of these protests. Okay. How did the Sons of Liberty use the Boston Massacre to inspire colonists to desire independence? Well, that is a great question because they actually are very tricky. They use it as propaganda to make people think that something really extreme happened, which makes other people want to fight back. They're the ones that actually give it the name of massacre, even though only 5 people died. And they especially publish things that make it look like the British were completely at fault for what happened here, when really it was maybe more of just a fight. Okay. All right. The writs of assistance, a vocab word that you could have gotten the definition from the back of your book. But they basically are search warrants that can be used anytime to go in to look for smuggled goods. And the colonists really had a problem with the writs of assistance because they said that the British government should not have the right to go in to people's homes without real evidence. Okay, a writ of assistance allowed them to search kind of any time, whether they had evidence that a person actually had smuggled goods or not. Okay. Another thing that colonists start doing in response to the British kind of abuses of them is that they form committees of correspondence. And so these were actually groups of people who would write letters to keep each other informed of what they called colonial affairs. Basically, all the colonies were separate from each other at this time, but the committees of correspondence were working towards unifying the colonies as one group, so that if all of the colonies knew what was going on, let's say in Massachusetts, in Boston, then people in Georgia or in New Hampshire could take action against the British government, and that they could all kind of work together. Okay, the Boston Tea Party, I know you will remember this one from the 5th grade. So the Sons of Liberty disguise themselves as natives, dump many pounds of tea into the Boston harbor. And the British are absolutely outraged at this because this is a huge destruction of property. Okay? The amount of tea that they destroyed represents a huge value to the British government, and in particular, this tea company. Okay? All right. The Intolerable Acts is actually the American name. The colonists call them the Intolerable Acts because they think that they are so horrible. But the British originally named them the Coercive Acts. If you coerce someone, it means you force them to do something. The Coercive Acts are in response to the protests that the colonists are doing. They're trying to force them to get back into line and to do the things that the British want them to do. Okay. Why does Parliament repeal the Townshend Acts? Well, we've got effective protest, right? Especially boycotts. Especially boycotts. The things that the colonists were doing were working. And so the British are trying to kind of get their colonies back in line by repealing some of the acts that they were fighting back against. Okay? The Townshend Acts, remember, was a tax on a whole bunch of imported goods. Our book gave us this big list like glass, paper, paint, lead, and tea. They take away all of those and they leave that last one. And so the act that replaces the Townshend Acts is called the Tea Act. And so that they take away all of those other taxes, they leave the tax on tea. Okay? Okay, a militia. A militia is not an organized army, but a militia is like a local group of men who are trained to defend their community. This is not the same thing as an army. So when the Americans decide that they're going to start training their militias, they are not raising an army against the British. They're training like local guys who are going to defend each individual town. This is not the same thing as an army. Let me keep saying that for you. Okay, the Declaratory Act. You probably remember this came after everything that had gone on with the Stamp Act, that the British had repealed the Stamp Act. And so it's simply a law that reminds the colonists, because they might have forgotten, that Parliament has the power and not the individual colonists. That it's Parliament that gets to make those decisions. Okay? All right, the Daughters of Liberty, they are the wives, the mothers, the daughters of the Sons of Liberty. Okay, so this is the female protesters. And they would do things like make homespun cloth in order to help with the boycotts. Okay, because if your wife could make it, you don't need to buy it from the British. Okay? And then the last question. We're at the very end here. Who was one of the major leaders of the Boston Sons of Liberty who urged the colonists to seek independence? Well, when you think about the Sons of Liberty, you should always be thinking about our guy, Samuel Adams. Hey, whenever you hear Boston Sons of Liberty, you got to think of Samuel Adams. Okay? All right. Well, thanks for watching, and I hope that you're going to get a great grade on your quiz.